Zoom code and the survey link. Moving on to our presentations, we have 3 presenters in this block. Our first presentation is on PDUFA VII post-marketing requirements, commitments, pre-approval and post-approval. And our presenter is Ms. Kathleen Weil. She serves as Senior Science Policy Analyst, PMC Program Manager, on the Safety Policy Research and Initiatives Team, or SPIRIT, within CDER's Office of New Drugs. Our next presenter, from our next presenter, we will hear how CDER is accelerating rare disease cures and the PDUFA VII Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot. Presenting will be Dr. Carrie Jolie, Associate Director for Rare Diseases for the Rare Diseases team within the Division of Rare Diseases and Medical Genetics in the Office of Rare Diseases, Pediatrics, Urology, and Reproductive Medicine. And our final presentation in this session is on PDUFA VII Chemistry Manufacturing Assessment Updates, and will be presented by Dr. Paresma Patel, Director of the Division of New Drug API in CDER's Office of New Drug Products, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Please welcome our presenters.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Weil. I'm the Senior Science Policy Analyst and PMC Program Manager in the Office of New Drugs at CDER. I appreciate being invited to talk to you about the new PDUFA VII PMR commitments today. The focus of my talk will be on the following: the 2 new PMR commitments under PDUFA VII. I'll also review the 4 authorities for PMRs. We'll discuss how the agency will communicate anticipated PMRs during pre-approval, and how the agency will review PMR release requests. So let's get started. In this slide, I'm going to define PMRs. They are essentially studies or trials that can be required under one of the 4 authorities listed here: Accelerated Approval, Animal Efficacy Rule, Pediatric Research Equity Act, which is PREA, and 50503 PMRs. The definition of studies or trials for both of those definitions can be found in the October 2019 guidance titled 50503 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that's listed below with the website address in the footnote on this slide. 50503 PMRs are related to safety and reduced effectiveness. As you may recall, FDA's authorities under 5050 were expanded in the Food and Drug Administration's Amendments Act, FDA, of 2007 and the Support Act of 2018. The Support Act stands for Substance Use Disorder Prevention that promotes opioid recovery and treatment for patients and communities. The first PMR commitment I'll review is related to communicating anticipated PMRs. Per the footnote below, anticipated PMRs are those studies or trials based on data received with the original application submission. This is a very important definition. This commitment addresses inconsistencies in the unpredictability in communicating anticipated PMRs, and it recognized a need for a standardized process. And in response to this observation, we created new internal timelines and processes for communicating these anticipated PMRs. Please note that this new commitment applies to only new molecular entity NDA applications and original BLA applications. To highlight the new timelines, anticipated PMRs will be communicated no later than 8 weeks before the PDUFA goal date for standard applications, no later than 6 weeks before the PDUFA goal date for priority applications. And please note that if major safety issues are identified in data that is received after the original application submission, then the timelines on this slide will not apply to communicating that safety PMR. We may refer to this as an unanticipated PMR. As far as PDUFA metrics, We will try to meet this goal 60% of the time in 2023, 70% of the time in 2024, and 80% of the time 2025 through 2027. After you receive the letter communicating anticipated PMRs, we would like you to encourage you to continue those discussions with the FDA about anticipated PMRs and PMCs. As you recall, post-marketing PMCs are post-marketing commitments, which are studies or trials agreed upon in writing between the FDA and the applicant. We may include those in our anticipated communication letter to maintain consistency within our PMR PMC program and to communicate any of those anticipated PMCs we are aware of at the time. Secondly, we'd like you to consider study or trial design. We prefer that you include only one study or one trial in each PMR or PMC. This facilitates our ability to track and monitor the progress of these studies and trials using the schedule of milestones, which brings us to the third point. Please start to prepare a list of those milestones. There should be at least one milestone in the schedule. The schedule may include those milestones listed here, such as a draft protocol submission, a final protocol submission, a study trial completion date, and a final report submission. Make sure your milestone dates are reasonable and they include time for the FDA to review, so for instance, the protocol. For longer studies and trials, we may want you to consider interim reporting submission milestones so that we can keep track of the progress of that study and trial over the years. As mentioned before, for some PMRs, only one milestone may be needed in the schedule. For instance, with animal efficacy PMRs, the study schedule may include only the final protocol submission milestone. Now let's discuss the second commitment, which is for post-approval or existing PMRs. This commitment is related to requests, as I said, to release existing PMRs. It was created to address the lack of a standardized process or timelines for reviewing the release requests related to existing PMRs. In response, the agency established several new standardized processes for reviewing these requests. As you can see, we created several processes and timelines related to the review of an applicant's release request. Going down the pathway to the right from the purple box at the top, when we receive a request to release a PMR, if a request is received and the agency needs additional information to make a release decision, we have 45 days to issue that request for additional information. Following the pathway down to the right, once we receive the additional information, we have 60 days to review the original and additional information and issue a release, not released decision letter. Starting at the top again and going down the pathway to the left, if we receive a release request and we don't need additional information, we have 60 days to review the request and issue a decision letter. This slide is a continuation of the PMR post-approval commitment regarding release requests. It specifically addresses requests for reconsideration. If an applicant receives a letter that denies the release of a PMR, what we call a not released letter, the applicant can submit a request for reconsideration of that decision. The request is reviewed by the division and senior leadership. And senior leadership will be addressed in several different committees, one of several different committees, either the MPPRC, MPCC, or PERC. It depends on which committee it goes to based on the information provided in the request and the type of the PMR. For example, all PREA PMRs will be reviewed by PERC, the Pediatric Review Committee. The agency has 45 days in this whole process to review the request, take it to senior leadership, and respond with a released or not released decision. So what are the next steps for the applicant to consider? Please ensure that a release request includes a complete justification and additional information or supporting information you think the agency will need. For a request for reconsideration, you should include the information submitted with the original request, any other supporting information you think will be helpful for the agency to make its decision. Additionally, applicants can help the FDA easily identify their submissions by clearly labeling the release requests with a PMR-PMC set number and including specific headings on the cover page related to the type of submission. So for instance, with original release requests, please clearly identify that with the PMR-PMC set number. If you're responding to additional information, please clearly identify that as additional information for the PMR-PMC release request, again with the PMR-PMC set number. And for requests for reconsideration to release the PMR-PMC. Please make sure that you submit only one release request per submission. This is our preference because it assists us with our internal processes and assigning a goal to that submission. Now for our first challenge question. During the pre-approval process, when should you review official communication about anticipated PMRs? Is it immediately after the mid-cycle meeting? Immediately after the late cycle meeting? Receive it by 8 weeks for a standard and 6 weeks for a priority before the PDUFA goal date for the application? Or in the approval letter? The answer is at 8 weeks or 6 weeks. You should receive this communication at least by that time. So now for our second challenge question. FDA is now required to provide a response to a release request for a PMR within how many days of receipt? 30 days? 60 days? 90 days? There's no requirement. The answer is B, 60 days. Some key takeaways from today's meeting include the following. We discussed 2 new PMR commitments under PDUFA VII. We also discussed the new process for communicating anticipated PMRs during pre-approval and when the applicant can expect to receive a letter communicating anticipated PMRs. Those 8 weeks before PDUFA goal date for standard applications and 6 weeks before the PDUFA goal date for priority applications. We also discussed new processes and timelines for reviewing release requests and when an applicant can expect the agency to respond. For release requests, we should respond within 60 days. And regarding requests for reconsideration, and including the review of the request and the additional information by the division and the senior leadership, our response should be within 45 days of receiving that request. I also provided some next steps for applicants related to both new PMR commitments that we'd like you to remember. Thank you for listening to this presentation today. I welcome any questions you may have.
Hello, my name is Dr. Carrie Jolie. I am the Associate Director for Rare Diseases and the lead for the Rare Diseases team. Our mission is to facilitate, support, and accelerate the development of drug and biologic products for the benefit of patients with rare disorders. We are located in CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And I'm very happy to be speaking with you today on how CDER is accelerating rare disease cures, as well as updates on the PDUFA VII Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot Program. This is my disclosure slide. I have a number of learning objectives for you today. The first is to discuss rare disease and orphan product approval trends in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. The second is to discuss challenges and considerations in rare disease drug development. And the third is to share updates on CDER's Accelerating Rare Disease Cures ARC program and on CDER's Prescription Drug User Fee Act 7 Rare Disease Commitment, the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot Program. And this latter is a joint venture between CDER and CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. When looking at the progress we've made in rare diseases between the years of 2015 and 2022, what you can see is that we really have made progress. CDER has approved 180 novel drugs for rare diseases in this time period, and that is exactly half of the drugs we have approved in total. The FDA has approved over 550 unique drugs and biologics for over 1,100 rare disease indications since the passage of the Orphan Drug Act in 1983. However, we are very, very cognizant of the fact that 30 million Americans live with a rare disease, and the vast majority of these do not have approved treatments. And therefore, we understand and are committed to the fact that there is still significant work to be done, despite the fact that we have made significant progress. This next figure shows the proportion of CDER novel drug approvals that are orphan over a time period starting in 2010 through 2022. Specifically, this figure shows the number of novel drug approvals over this time in columns for each year that are divided into the number of orphan novel approvals in green and non-orphan drug approvals in blue. The purple line above indicates the percentage of orphan drug approvals of all approvals in a specific year. And so what you can see is that since 2010, the number of orphan approvals has risen dramatically for CDER. And in addition, the percentage of all approvals that are orphan in each year has increased. This continued in 2022, where we approved 20 orphan drug approvals in comparison to 17 non-orphan approvals, and this is 54%. The next slide I wanted to show because it's a visual representation of CDER's use of expedited development programs. These are intended to facilitate and expedite development and review of new drugs to address unmet medical need in the treatment of serious or life-threatening conditions, which includes many rare disorders. You'll note that in dark blue, we have the non-orphan percentages for each expedited program pathway or program, and in red, we have the orphan programs, the percentage of orphan programs that utilized these. And I think overwhelmingly, the takeaway here is that the orphan drug programs really make use of these programs that are intended to expedite development to a higher degree than those that are non-orphan. The expedited programs come with such benefits as increased engagement with the FDA, the ability to utilize rolling review, or in the case of the accelerated approval program pathway, the potential approval of an application based on a reasonably likely surrogate. So what have we learned from all of the programs that we review in CDER? And really what we've learned is that we face common challenges in rare disease drug development. We know that our natural history is poorly understood, which is incredibly important when it comes to planning and designing a trial that can demonstrate benefit. We know that diseases are progressive, serious, life-limiting, and often lack adequate approved therapies, so there's urgent need here. We also know that many of these conditions have a pediatric onset, and so there's an additional layer of challenges in both drug developments and pediatric populations. We know that there's very small populations, so this often restricts study design options. We know that there, within very small populations, can still be phenotypic and genotypic diversity within a disorder. This makes it very challenging when you go to select the patient population specifically in which you need to study the potential effect of a therapy. We know that development programs often lack a solid translational background, and this can be critical to several elements that are just really important in rare disease drug development, such as the strength of confirmatory evidence. When you're thinking of utilizing a pathway towards demonstrating substantial evidence for effectiveness, that is one adequate and well-controlled trial plus confirmatory evidence. Translational background is also critically important to the selection of a surrogate that you believe represents or is reasonably likely to represent a direct clinical benefit. Drug development tools can be lacking, so outcome measures and biomarkers. And also the lack of precedent, including clinically meaningful endpoints. These are often, first novel studies in patient populations that don't have a therapy. So the selection of an endpoint is novel, and this can be very challenging in drug development for many rare diseases. There are also common considerations for the environment of rare disease drug development. So there's many smaller companies that have less regulatory experience. There are active patient stakeholder groups who are looking to navigate and participate in rare disease drug development. There is a dedicated academic community that may have limited knowledge of regulatory requirements, so that's not what they're thinking of when they are engaging or embarking on academic exploration or aspects of clinical trial development. So from the CDER perspective, where we receive drug applications to review for the establishment of substantial evidence of effectiveness and safety, it's our duty to engage with our stakeholders to enhance their understanding of the regulatory process and to gain their alignment and support. So how do we do this? We do this through our Accelerating Rare Disease Cures program. And so with this program, we came together approximately a year ago with a vision of speeding and increasing the development of effective and safe treatment options to address the unmet needs of patients with rare diseases, with a mission to really drive scientific and regulatory innovation and engagement to accelerate the availability of treatments for patients with rare diseases. This is a schematic of what CDER's Accelerating Rare Disease Cures program looks like. The CDER ARC program serves as an umbrella. It is governed by the senior leadership from the Office of New Drugs, the Office of the Center Director, and the Office of Translational Science. And the reason these three offices have come together is because they are really the center of evaluating and dealing with rare disease drug applications on a day-by-day basis as part of their everyday work. And therefore, they are best poised to inform and align on policy development and share information about rare disease drug development to best address the challenges that I enumerated on previous slides. The program is managed by the Rare Diseases team. We serve as the Program Management Office to execute CDER's ARC program. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we are PDUFA mandated to advance the development of drugs for rare diseases for the center. And in serving this role for CDER's ARC program, this really enables us to fulfill our mission. Now, although CDER's ARC program is governed and managed by the offices and team that I just discussed, we work very closely across CDER with other offices and divisions to rely on their expertise for various issues regarding rare disease drug development. For example, we work closely with the Office of Medical Policy, where real-world data evaluation and real-world evidence policy come out of. We work very closely with the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology when needed for real-world data as well, as post-marketing issues related to rare disease drug development. We might work with the Office of Strategic Programs when it comes to decision-making and evaluation for benefit risk. And then other CDER offices and divisions are pulled in depending on the issues that we are addressing. Under CDER's ARC program umbrella, we also work very closely with other FDA offices and programs because tackling the challenges in rare diseases truly requires a collaborative approach and a community. And so CDER's ARC program works very closely with the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research on many of our issues, as well as the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. The Oncology Center of Excellence is another partner when it comes to rare disease drug development and evaluation. And within the Office of Commissioner, we work very closely with certain offices, specifically the Office of Orphan Product Development, the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, or the Patient Affairs staff as needed. I encourage you all to visit our CDER ARC website and email us at cderarcprogram@fda.hhs.gov. Year one for the ARC program has been all about engagement. So I'm going to highlight just a few of the conferences that we developed, planned, participated in, because our goal in this engagement was not only to share our regulatory perspective on innovation and how to address challenges in rare diseases for topics that were very important to stakeholders, both externally and internally, but also to keep these incredible programs on a shared website for stakeholders in perpetuity, so that when we come together and share innovative learnings and discuss challenging problems, anyone can come to our website and then view these conferences and the topics that they addressed moving forward in order that it's really beneficial to as many people as possible. So the first conference that happened around the time of our close to the time of the inauguration of the ARC program was an FDA NIH conference on regulatory fitness in rare disease clinical trials. And this was a really broad overview conference of challenges that brought together all the different disciplines and how they approach these challenges in rare disease drug development. The conference was done between the Rare Diseases team and the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the NIH. And the focus was really on academic investigators and those who were looking on how to bridge that gap between academic investigation and the regulatory aspects of a drug development program. Later that month, there was an FDA Duke Margolis virtual public workshop that centered around the importance of translational science in drug development, so surrogate endpoints, biomarkers, and more. That was put on between the Office of Drug Evaluation and Science within the Office of New Drugs, as well as the Office of Clinical Pharmacology. The focus there was on translational science and its use in the development of surrogate endpoints. Two more conferences that have just recently taken place. One was the FDA CDER Johns Hopkins Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation CIRSE workshop on addressing challenges in the design and analysis of rare disease clinical trials, so considerations and tools. The CDER's Rare Diseases team worked very closely with our Office of Biostatistics as well as Johns Hopkins University to put on a wonderful 2-half-day conference on how to collect high quality and fit for purpose data for rare disease clinical trials, the use of real world data to inform rare disease drug development, the design and analysis of methodologies for use in rare disease clinical trials. And that was a really wonderful conference that if you haven't seen, we know that many of these topics are of the utmost importance to our rare disease stakeholders, which was the impetus for putting on the conference. But again, it is available in perpetuity on the ARC website. Also, there was an FDA CDER and University of Maryland Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science CIRSE workshop, creating a roadmap to quantitative systems pharmacology, informed rare disease drug development. And as one can imagine, this was primarily the Office of Clinical Pharmacology within CDER that led and planned this conference in conjunction with the University of Maryland. And so this is another important one that will live on in perpetuity on the ARC website. Patient engagement is equally important, as patients are the foundation and the reason for developing therapies. and their input is critical. CDER staff during our first year of ARC engaged in no less than 23 rare disease patient listening sessions with patient groups. Now, patient listening sessions are held by the Office of Commissioner's Patient Affairs staff or CDER's Professional Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement, and you can go to that website to learn more about those. CDER staff also engaged in 19 patient-focused drug development meetings. And the patient-focused drug development meetings are held by the patient-focused drug development staff within the Office of Center Director in CDER, and those are critically important as well. We also wanted to increase our communication and transparency about rare disease activities. We've heard from people it's hard to know what's going on across CDER when it comes to rare diseases. So one of the things we did with ARC was launch a quarterly newsletter, which you should really go and subscribe to hear more about these conferences, other conferences, public-private partnerships, and other rare disease news that's highlighted going on across the center. We've also recently added a rare disease filter to FDA TRACK. So the FDA TRACK has a Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Drugs and Biologics tracker. And what we are now currently doing is adding a rare disease filter to the information that is provided on FDA TRACK, so that the public really has an understanding of how rare disease approvals are progressing. And finally, one of the most important things that we've sort of engaged on at CDER ARC during this year of engagement is the Learning and Education to Advance and Empower Rare Disease Drug Developers, the LEADER 3D project. So what is LEADER 3D? This is where CDER really sought input from stakeholders who design or conduct rare disease drug development programs. The purpose behind this is to identify knowledge gaps for stakeholders about the regulatory process of rare disease drug development, and then using the information that we receive for us to be able to create or expand educational resources for stakeholders. Through this engagement, we're hoping to better understand exactly what the challenges are in bringing rare disease drug products to market. In identifying these knowledge gaps and producing educational materials, what we were really focusing on was what types of non-clinical and clinical pharmacology considerations are stakeholders struggling with, what clinical trial design and interpretation issues are stakeholders struggling with, and what regulatory considerations for rare disease drug development are stakeholders struggling with. In parallel with this LEADER 3D effort, CDER is additionally working with the National Organization for Rare Disorders, or NORD, to develop an advanced drug development education series for patients and patient groups. And you can read more about this at the link that's provided. Next, I want to turn to some updates in a program that is not directly run by ARC, but we expect to take a lot of the learnings under the umbrella of ARC and translate those to stakeholders internally and externally. And it's the PDUFA VII pilot program, the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement pilot program. The impetus behind this program is that it provides a mechanism for sponsors to collaborate with the FDA throughout the efficacy endpoint development process. So as I mentioned before, this is a challenge in rare disease. These are often novel endpoints. And a lot of time is spent on the challenges of trial design, which are many in rare disease drug development. And what we really felt was important, and what stakeholders felt was important in constructing PDUFA VII, was spending time to focus on that development of a novel endpoint that we're confident can demonstrate whether or not a therapy meets that bar of substantial evidence of effectiveness. So in order for a proposal to be submitted to this REdI program, which, as I said, affords increased interaction with the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research as well as the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, this is a joint program. The associated development program should be active and address a rare disease with an active IND or pre-IND for the rare disease. There are some caveats for that. If there is a natural history study, for example, which is intended to look at an endpoint for a future study, then that might be able to be submitted as well. The proposed endpoint is a novel efficacy endpoint intended to establish substantial evidence of effectiveness for a rare disease treatment. And what we mean by novel in this setting is that an endpoint could be considered novel if it's never been used before to support a drug approval, or if it's been substantially modified from previous use to support a drug approval. And really, when we're looking at selection for this program, preference is going to be given to proposals that have the potential to impact drug development more broadly. So one that utilizes a novel approach to develop an efficacy endpoint, or an endpoint that could be potentially relevant to other diseases. Preference will also be given to accepting proposals that reflect, as the program grows, a range of different types of endpoints. This is a pilot program, so there's a limited number of qualified proposals that are going to be selected. In fiscal year 23, there's a maximum of 1. The program opens July 1st. In fiscal year 24 through 27, FDA will accept up to 1 proposal per quarter with a maximum of 3 proposals per year. For transparency, because it's very important that we translate learnings from these programs more broadly to rare disease stakeholders, FDA will conduct up to 3 public workshops by the end of fiscal year 2027 to discuss various topics related to endpoint development. Also, novel endpoints developed throughout REdI may be presented by us in guidance document or on our public-facing website or at the aforementioned public workshops. And this may occur prior to the FDA's approval for the drug studied in a trial. Sponsors will complete the REdI pilot program once they have completed the maximum of 4 REdI meetings and do not have additional endpoint-focused questions or issues to discuss with us. Advice provided during these meetings does not constitute a regulatory decision and is considered non-binding. Completion of this meeting process doesn't guarantee approval. It's to help you develop an efficacy endpoint that is novel for a rare disease. After completing these meetings, however, the sponsor can certainly request additional input through any. Updates on REdI include the fact that we now have a website, which I encourage everyone to visit. There are frequently asked questions on this website, so if you have questions about the program, check there first. They may already be answered. You should also be able to see proposal elements. You should see meeting package elements. You should see disclosure elements. And also links to endpoint development resources for the different and various types of endpoints that you may be constructing. I also wanted to take the moment to put in a plug for a virtual public workshop that is taking place tomorrow and the 8th. So it's a 2-day workshop. It is jointly hosted by Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. There's a link to register if you haven't heard of this workshop already. And if you have questions, you can always email us at REdI meetings. So the conclusions from this talk is that in recent years, over 50% of CDER's novel drug approvals were for rare diseases. CDER's ARC program will help CDER work more effectively under our rare disease umbrella with all of our rare disease drug development partners. And CDER's ARC program really does look forward to sharing learnings from other rare disease programs, such as the PDUFA VII Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot Program. I have a few challenge questions for the group. Looking at CDER novel drug approvals from 2015 to 2022, approximately what percentage were for use in non-rare diseases versus rare orphan designation projects? And the answers are here. The correct answer, I'm giving people just a moment to input their answers, is 50%. And our challenge question 2 is that the REdI program will provide the opportunity for sponsors to engage with the FDA on what aspect of drug development? Model-informed drug development, complex innovative design, rare disease endpoint advancement, or all of the above? It's a tricky question, but the rare disease endpoint advancement is the correct answer. We have additional PDUFA programs for model-informed drug development and complex innovative design. Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed speaking with you all today. and I look forward to talking with you all in the question and answer session.
Good afternoon. My name is Pareshma Patel, and today I'll be presenting on Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Controls Assessment with a focus on expedited clinical programs, and I'll provide some recent updates under PDUFA VII. I'm currently a Division Director within the Office of New Drug Products under the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. By the end of today's presentation, you should be able to describe some PDUFA VII product quality enhancements, name some common regulatory strategies to address CMC challenges under expedited programs, and understand the CMC development and readiness pilot, generally the application process, eligibility, and selection criteria. The outline of today's presentation is shown here. I'll start with a brief overview of product quality. Under PDUFA VII, there are a few enhancements that are directly related to CMC assessment activities, and today I'll be highlighting the enhancements related to facilitating CMC readiness for products with accelerated clinical development timelines. I'll specifically focus on two areas. One is a recently published map that published at the end of last year, entitled Quality Assessment for Products and Expedited Programs. And the other is a CMC development and readiness pilot that I'll briefly highlight from the CDER perspective. I'll end with a brief summary and provide some resources. I'd like to give you a brief overview of the vision of the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, which really describes the end goal when moving from clinical development to commercialization. We believe that a quality product of any kind consistently meets the expectations of the user, and drugs are really no different. Patients expect safe and effective medicine with every dose that they take, and pharmaceutical quality is assuring that every dose is safe and effective, free of contamination and defects. And this is really what gives patients the confidence in their next dose of medicine. I'll start off by highlighting a recently published map titled Quality Assessment for Products and Expedited Programs. This map really outlines OPQ's current thinking on how to work with sponsors on CMC development for products with accelerated clinical timelines, specifically products that have been granted breakthrough or fast-track designation, or products that are part of the CMC readiness pilot, which I'll discuss toward the end of today's presentation. This map may also be considered for products that are mission critical and examples of products that may address public health emergencies such as COVID-19 where there are no available treatments. It may also include products meant to address drug shortages or have orphan drug designation. This map provides examples of regulatory flexibilities that may be considered to address CMC challenges or to expedite CMC development where it's warranted. And the emphasis generally are two things. One is early engagement between sponsors and FDA when products have an expedited clinical development timeline, and the use of a science and risk-based approach in making regulatory decisions and applying flexibilities as they are warranted. And of course, the end goal here is really the anticipated clinical benefit for earlier patient access to drugs. The Office of New Drugs, which is where our clinical divisions reside, typically identifies products that qualify for an expedited program designation. And this is really based on the information that a product has demonstrated the potential to diagnose, treat, or prevent a serious disease or condition for an unmet medical need. Once that designation has been granted, the OPQ assessment team, focused on product quality, plays a significant role in communicating early with sponsors. The team actively participates in industry meetings, including providing forward-thinking and detailed advice for CMC-related issues in a variety of meetings, including Type B, Type C, and Type D meetings, typically focused in CMC-focused meetings. The team works to determine the status and progress of CMC development and the proposed plans for commercial manufacturing. We also review the strategy to ensure that commercial facilities are ready for manufacturing and are GMP compliant. We work to identify opportunities to expedite CMC development using a benefit risk framework as well. And we identify potential regulatory flexibilities that may be warranted in the program. The team also considers the data and information that should be submitted to support a marketing application and the timing of that data. So for example, there may be data that should be submitted at the time of NDA filing, for example, and other data that may be acceptable to be submitted during the NDA review cycle or even post-approval. The assessment team generally aims to engage early with sponsors and establishes a communication plan for meetings and other interactions to agree to regulatory approaches by the time a marketing application is actually submitted. I won't spend too much time on this subject, but I would like to briefly discuss the topic of facility readiness. To facilitate a marketing application, FDA really encourages early and enhanced communication for facility assessment at early CMC-focused meetings. This includes identifying any intended commercial facilities, including those facilities that may be used for commercial-scale manufacturing, testing, or packaging, as well as any facilities as part of referenced drug master files that may be submitted as part of the marketing application. Any non-commercial facilities that may generate data needed to support the marketing application. Cross-referenced applications such as drug master files should have letters of authorization submitted to the applications as well. Information on the commercial manufacturing process in comparison to the clinical manufacturing processes. The sponsors plan to ensure that commercial facilities are GMP compliant and ready for inspection. The proposed strategy for commercial launch, particularly if there's anything atypical. And I'll discuss some potential regulatory flexibilities in the next few slides related to commercial launch. The strategy for submitting facility information and the timing for that information, whether that should be submitted in an IND or in the NDA, and that should be really discussed early with FDA. And something that's more specific to BLAs is the submission of production schedules and manufacturing schedules. With this information, OPQ's Office of Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Assessment works with the Office of Regulatory Affairs to assess and make recommendations related to facilities. One area that is emphasized in this map is examples of regulatory flexibilities and approaches, and some general areas for consideration. I'm going to briefly discuss and list the general areas here, and then I'll kind of go into them in a little more detail over the next few slides. The basic areas and examples provided in the map of flexibilities are related to control strategies, process validation, analytical procedures, marketing of batches manufactured with the clinical manufacturing route instead of the intended commercial process, and finally, stability data that's needed for a marketing application and the studies to support marketing. One area of flexibility is related to control strategies. The amount of flexibility that may be warranted is based on the sponsor's experience and overall understanding of the product and manufacturing process. And all of the available data is considered when related to control strategies. Of course, the greater the understanding of these aspects, including a thorough understanding of the product and manufacturing process, analytical methods, and capabilities, really helps the agency consider any alternative approaches that may be needed for controls. The OPQ team typically will meet with sponsors and discuss strategies to establish commercial controls or specifications and acceptance criteria. Besides the overall manufacturing experience, the team will also consider the proposed justifications and assess the benefit risk considerations for the product, taking into account the expedited clinical designation. Often, sponsors with expedited development programs may have limited manufacturing history, clinical experience, And in these cases, the OPQ team may consider additional steps as part of the considerations for the overall control strategy. And this may include asking for additional specification test or in-process testing due to the limited data. This may require some narrow acceptance criteria or process parameters. And there may be the option of setting wider limits until additional data are available. The use of comparability protocols or CMC-focused post-marketing commitments to revise specification test or acceptance criteria once more knowledge and experience is available is also an option. And finally, there may be times when analytical methods may need revisions, and these could be considered as part of a post-marketing commitment. There are a few alternate approaches when that may be considered for process validation, particularly stage 2 validation, which is the process qualification of the commercial process to demonstrate reproducibility and must be completed prior to commercial distribution. There are different requirements for process validation for NDAs versus BLAs, and the focus here will be that any alternate approaches should really be discussed early with the OPQ team. As part of the stage 2 validation, based on the amount of data that is available, there may be flexibilities in the submission strategy, and certain studies may be submitted post-approval. Decoupling of the drug substance and drug product process validation is also a potential flexibility. Because both drug substance and drug product processes need validation, it may be possible to perform the PPQ activities in parallel to the drug product. As long as the drug substance used in the drug product PPQ activities are considered comparable and representative of the commercial drug substance process. Another potential flexibility that may be discussed with the agency is concurrent validation and release approaches. OPQ may consider accepting a plan for commercial release of the stage 2 validation batches before all of the validation activities have actually been fully completed. Typically, to accept a plan like this, the review team would need to see the data supports that the process is in a state of control, and that the process is capable of consistently delivering quality product, meeting the specifications and quality attributes. The equipment and testing methods should be qualified and validated, and there should be a commitment from the sponsor to submit stability data for the concurrent validation post-approval. And finally, the overall submission strategy for data and the protocol to be submitted should be discussed with the OPQ review team. I mostly covered the flexibilities related to analytical procedures in the context of control strategies, and I want to touch on flexibilities related to analytical methods and validation of those methods. For submission of NDAs or BLAs, the regulatory requirements should be consistent with those outlined in 21 CFR 314 and 601, respectively. In general, the analytical methods used to support the control strategy should be suitable for their intended purpose. There may be situations, though, during the review cycle where there may be changes that are needed and to the analytical methods, and these changes may be implemented as post-approval commitments, as long as the control strategy is acceptable for approval. It's important for sponsors to know that these types of confirmatory changes may be considered as a PMC if the assessment team finds that to be an acceptable approach. Another potential alternate approach is marketing or launching with clinical batches. Sponsors may consider this in situations where they intend to scale up the clinical manufacturing process for commercial manufacturing, and the scale-up activities may delay the commercial launch of their product. In these situations, commercial distribution with clinical batches may be considered, and the following information would need to be submitted to support the strategy. Identification of the manufacturing facilities that were used, that are intended to be used for commercial distribution. Any material for commercial manufacturing has to meet FDA standards, including GMP regulations. Facility readiness for inspection. reminders that the stage 2 validation requirements, and those reminders are kind of communicated to the sponsor from the OPQ review team. And scale-up activities can be facilitated by either comparability protocols or PMCs related to those activities for scale-up. Another area that I would like to briefly touch on is commercial launch with stockpiled clinical batches. In these situations, OPQ would need additional information on the facility that manufactured the clinical batches. If the material was manufactured using a process that is representative of the commercial or commercial process and intended commercial processes for future batches, the quality of the batches should be reflective of the commercial control strategy and meet any updated specifications as part of the application. And of course, the batches should be distributed with approved labeling. Flexibilities related to stability data and stability studies are often considered and evaluated by the OPQ review teams. The OPQ assessment team considers all available data and information, including product and process understanding, supportive stability data, and any relevant prior knowledge. If an alternate approach is being proposed for submission of stability data, the FDA encourages sponsors to discuss the strategy with the OPQ team early. Specifically, the aim would be to seek agreement on the stability data and overall strategy to establish a shelf life or retest period prior to submission of a marketing application. FDA would also recommend that sponsors also clarify the data and information that will be submitted and the timing of that data, whether it should be submitted at filing or can be submitted during the review cycle, for example. Examples of regulatory flexibility or stability data or studies include submission of less than the recommended amount of data for primary stability batches, additional stability data being submitted during the review cycle for an NDA or BLA review, stability data from batches that may differ in size from the recommendations outlined in ICH Q&A. So for example, batches that are less than the pilot scale. And then submission of supportive data may be considered and may be helpful to establish a retest or shelf life that is longer than would be possible if relying only on the primary stability data in batches alone. In these cases, the OPQ team would assess comparability between the supportive stability data to ensure that they are representative of the commercial process. This map also addresses the use of predictive stability models and focuses on use of mathematical modeling of stability data to establish a retest date or stability or shelf life, specifically for NDAs. Predictive stability modeling may be used to establish comparability between primary and supportive stability batches as well, and may be used as part of the justification for using supportive stability data. The evaluation of any proposed stability model will really be evaluated based on the capability of the model to capture all relevant stability factors, for example, temperature, light, and humidity, the validation of the data demonstrating that the model's kinetic assumptions are appropriate, applicability of the model to the container closure system, and then information on whether product stability indicating critical quality attributes were considered when establishing the model. And then information on situations where that model would not really be appropriate. I would like to summarize this portion of my talk. MAP 5015.13 outlines the quality assessment considerations and regulatory flexibilities for products and expedited clinical programs. FDA really encourages early engagement to address any CMC challenges for these types of products. And finally, the goal here is really to provide patients with earlier access to new drugs and biologics. This brings us to challenge question number 1. The MAP Quality Assessment for Products and Expedited Programs describes regulatory flexibilities for all of the following except A. Process validation approaches, B. Control strategies, C. Stability studies, or D. CGMP requirements. The answer is D. The MAP covers flexibilities for process validation approaches, control strategies, and stability studies, but does not include any flexibilities when it comes to CGMP requirements. Next, I would like to briefly introduce the CMC Development and Readiness Pilot and provide a very quick CDER perspective for this pilot. The background for this pilot is that often development of CDER regulated drugs with unmet medical needs have an accelerated clinical timeline. And marketing applications for products in expedited programs still need to meet FDA's approval standards. However, products may face challenges expediting certain CMC activities that are required for submission in a marketing application. Therefore, the goals of this pilot are really to facilitate CMC development in accordance with the timeline of clinical development. This would include additional interactions with FDA during development, use of science and risk-based regulatory approaches, streamlining CMC development, and again, the goal here is earlier patient access to products. And I think one of the other goals overall for this pilot is to learn how to do this better and really understand how we could expedite CMC development when there is expedited clinical development. This pilot is really part of the PDUFA VII commitment letter and the associated Federal Register notice published last fall. The pilot will accept between 8 to 10 proposals every year for a 4-year period. 6 of those will be CBER-led products, and 3 applications per year will be accepted for CDER-led products. The Federal Register notice outlines that the sponsors who apply and are selected will have some additional interactions with FDA, including product-specific CMC advice during development, 2 additional CMC-focused Type B meetings, limited additional CMC-focused discussions, and the hope is that these interactions will lead to a mutual understanding of the approaches to CMC information that should be submitted for a marketing application. I'll go over some of the basic eligibility criteria for this pilot. The sponsor should have an active commercial IND in electronic common technical document format. The application should generally be submitted before the end of phase 2, with some exceptions, such as if the development is following an innovative trial design or intended to treat a rare disease. The thought here is that it would be most beneficial to participate in the pilot so that there is sufficient time to discuss CMC development and address any CMC challenges. The sponsor should demonstrate a commitment to pursue CMC development aligned with an expedited clinical development timeline. And for applications under consideration for CDER, the application should be intended for approval as an NDA or BLA. The program should be under an expedited clinical timeframe with anticipated benefits for earlier patient access, such as breakthrough or fast track designation. Sponsors who do not meet these criteria may still apply, even if they don't have expedited designation, and the eligibility will be determined by FDA, typically in consultation with our Office of New Drugs. The published FRN also describes the full request to participate process, which includes providing a description of the CMC development program, the projected timeline for product development and how that aligns with clinical development, information on CMC activities that are anticipated to yield a complete CMC data package, and information that would be needed for the marketing application. any identified CMC challenges that would require FDA input, and then proposed timing for the additional Type B meetings if the applicant does have that information and is selected for the pilot, of course. The request to participate should really include a CMC development status and plans. That includes the available information on product characterization and critical quality attributes, information on the current status of drug substance and drug product manufacturing processes and control strategies. Particularly, it'd be helpful to know if bioassays are used for your product and information on those bioassay development. Any plans for commercial manufacturing or control strategies, if those are known. Information on the proposed facilities and inspection history for for commercial launch, if available, and then drug substance and drug product assessment plans for stability. And finally, information on process validation plans as well. Now, of course, FDA acknowledges that it's unlikely early in development that all of this information will be available, but for the request to participate, what we're really looking for is as much information as possible about the sponsor's current thinking and their thoughts for moving towards commercialization and any specific challenges that may be seen. The pilot applications will be reviewed in a quarterly manner. And FDA will aim to notify sponsors of their selection to the pilot within 180 days of receipt. The pilot will generally accept an average of 9 applications per year, as I noted earlier, and 3 of those will be within CDER. The overall criteria for selection will be based on whether or not facilitating earlier patient access would be clinically beneficial, the overall novelty of the product, the complexity of the product and the manufacturing process or technology, the sponsor's overall manufacturing experience, and overall experience with the specific product type, class, or manufacturing process that will be used. And finally, I think it's important to note that the FDA is aiming to achieve a balance and diversity in the product types, sponsors, and therapeutic indications for this pilot. I would like to summarize this portion of the talk. At this stage, the CMC development and readiness pilot really aims to facilitate CMC development for products with expedited clinical timelines. The emphasis is really to increase communication between FDA and sponsors for these types of programs. The pilot started in April of 2023, and applications will be accepted throughout the year, and sponsors are really invited to apply for this pilot. The overall goal is to provide patients with earlier access to new drugs and biologics. And I would also like to draw your attention to a CDER perspective that will be presented at the latter end of this week, June 8th through 9th, on the same pilot, on the CDRP pilot, and there will be additional details presented in that presentation. So this brings me to challenge question number 2. How many CDER CDRP applications will be selected per year under the pilot? 10, 6, 3, or all of them? The correct answer is 3. CDER will take 3 applications per year and on average, and CBER will accept 6 applications per year on average. And with that, I would like to provide you with some resources. These are resources for the CMC development and readiness pilot. The website provides information on the Federal Register notice and additional information on how to apply. And shown here are resources for the quality assessment for products and expedited programs, including a link to the map, as well as some other guidance documents that are referenced as part of the map. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I would like to thank you.
Thank you for those excellent presentations. We are now ready to roll right into our panel session. So if you have not had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We will again answer as many questions as time allows. It looks like there are some questions rolling in. Let's see, let's start with Ms. Weil. We have a question for you here. For PMR release requests, is it preferred to have a meeting to discuss the status and release of the PMR first, or should the sponsor provide FDA the rationale for release of a PMR directly to an application and labeled as described in the presentation?
Hi, yes, this is Kathy. That's a very good question, and we're coming across that. And I think it depends on the timeline that you're looking for a response. So sometimes a meeting may be preferable, and you might get a written response before you would get a response related to the release request timeline. But if you submitted a release request, it goes on a 60-day clock under the new process. So it just really depends on what your timing is, what your preferred timing is for a response, because those timelines are a bit different.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions for you. So could you talk a little bit about FDA's expectations for CMC-specific PMCs and PMRs? Are these typically published on the FDA website or included in the approval letters?
So I'm not the CMC PMC expert. That would be Prisma, Dr. Patel. So what I can answer for you, okay, CMC first stands for Chemistry Manufacturing Controls. And there are actually some CMC PMRs, post-marketing requirements. If they're safety related, they fall usually under the 50503 PMR authority. And so if a CMC study happens to be required under 50503, it would be published on FDA's PMR PMC website. And the status would be displayed every quarter. We update that website at on or around the end of January, April, July, and October. And of course, they would appear in the approval letters. And you, under our current process, should see them as anticipated PMRs if we have that information available by the time, either 8 weeks for standard or 6 weeks for priority before the PDUFA goal date. I can tell you CMC PMCs are not published on FDA's website. They are considered non-reportable. Reportable PMCs under what we call 506B PMCs are considered those that fall under clinical safety study or trials, clinical efficacy, clinical pharmacology, or non-clinical toxicology studies and trials. So that's what the difference is between a non-reportable PMC and a reportable PMC. So I can address those two. And from my experience, and Dr. Patel, please feel free to chime in, I have seen these CMC PMCs as part of the approval letter, and have had the privilege of working with the division and CDER and OND and OPQ on some of those PMCs.
Thank you. Let's see, we've got one more question for you here. What information can we expect to see about anticipated PMRs in the communication?
So as far as, I think I lost you a little bit there. I think you asked what is expected to see in the anticipated PMR communication letter. Was that the question?
Yes, sorry about that. What information
okay.
can we expect? What information can we expect to see about anticipated PMRs in the communication letter?
So as per the PDUFA VII commitment letter, the agency agreed to add available information about the purpose of the study and trial, the study trial design elements, study trial type and population. So those are things we think we will know by the time that letter goes out and is issued. However, please remember this letter will not include a schedule of milestones because it's too soon. It won't include a PMR PMC set number. Those will all be discussed in what we call an engagement period between the time that anticipated PMR letter is issued and the time the PDUFA goal is met and the approval letter is issued. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a few questions coming in for Dr. Carrie Jo Lee. Dr. Lee, is there a priority for a disease that has a severe phenotype or one that affects a larger number of cases?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We talked a lot about expedited programs today, and I think what the person is asking is how one qualifies for that, and really it's about whether or not it's a serious condition, right? So it's a condition associated with morbidity that really has the potential to interrupt day-to-day functioning, which is why so many of our rare diseases, irrespective of how rare they are on the spectrum, qualify for the expedited programs. And those are, again, fast track, breakthrough, priority review, and then there's a separate approval pathway. There's an additional approval pathway for the accelerated approvals. And again, this is really about whether or not these are serious conditions, often whether or not there's unmet need. It could be rare or not rare.
Thank you. We have another question for you. To overcome small populations for rare diseases, do you allow more global reach of patient population?
So that's another great question. Rare disease drug development is absolutely global. And we work very hard at the FDA in partnership with our international regulatory partners. We have an international rare diseases cluster which is between the FDA, the European Medicines Association or Agency, and Health Canada. So we meet routinely to discuss shared indications and scientific considerations related to protocols and marketing applications in order to promote global collaboration in rare diseases. And it is not uncommon to have patients enrolled in multinational trials.
Thanks. One more question for you before we move on to Dr. Patel. If a drug's mechanism of action is similar between a rare disease and a non-rare disease, it may be possible for the drug developer to utilize animal efficacy data of this mechanism of action to support an ODD application for the rare disease indication.
Yep, I lost you a little bit at
This
the end,
is a
but I
question.
yeah, I think what the asker is getting towards, or at least the way that I'm taking it, is if you have a really good animal model, can you utilize that in support of for efficacy in a rare disease marketing application? Now, this would, in general, be in the setting of one adequate and well-controlled clinical trial plus confirmatory evidence, and that confirmatory evidence can be a number of things. And whether or not an animal model could additionally be utilized to support confirmatory evidence for an application is really going to depend on the strength of that model. And this is why translational science, whether it's an animal model or in vitro work, is so critical in rare disease drug applications. So it's going to depend on the adequacy of that animal model for the rare disease in question. It's going to depend on whether or not you have defined pathophysiology for that rare disease so that you are confident that the therapeutic and the target that it engages does in fact have a clinically meaningful benefit on the outcome for that disease. So there's a number of factors that would go into play on the strength of the use of an animal model for a rare disease indication. And definitely in those cases, I would say to come early to the FDA and describe your thinking so that we can advise on the strengths of that model for the use in which you are intending.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Let's move on to Dr. Patel. First question, what are the criteria to participate in the pilot program?
Thanks for that question. So the criteria for the CDRP pilot are really clearly outlined in the FRN, and I think I provided the link to the website there. But I just want to kind of briefly go through it. A few of the basic criteria include that the IND has to be an ECTD format, which is electronic common technical document. Typically, we want to see something that's as early as feasible, so before the end of phase 2, so that we actually have time to interact with sponsors and provide helpful advice as development is proceeding. One of the other eligibility criteria is that there's a commitment to actually pursue CMC development in alignment with the expedited clinical development. And then one of the other criteria to participate is that you either have an expedited clinical timeframe, so that there would be anticipated clinical benefit for earlier patient access, so something like either breakthrough or fast track designation. However, there, FDA is encouraging sponsors that may meet this criteria but not have one of the designations to that they can still apply, and the eligibility will be determined by FDA once we actually see the whole application in hand. So those are just kind of the highlights of the requirements and criteria to participate as part of the pilot. But the FRN does clearly also provide some specific CBER versus CDER eligibility criteria. And I do encourage anybody that can to attend the CBER talk later this week, because there's more time dedicated to the pilot discussion in that talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Patel. Another question for you. If this is an ultra-orphan drug and the clinical batch is sufficient for at least a year of commercial supply, is this sufficient justification to perform process validation post-approval?
So thank you for that question. And I guess I would just want to clarify that the for an marketing under 505B, so for an NDA, process validation is not a requirement at the time of marketing. So an application can be submitted without having that process validation done, and that would be conducted after approval of an application. And I think I do want to point out, though, in a situation like this, it is helpful to discuss with the agency if there's any plans for flexibility, especially in a situation of an ultra orphan drug where you may have limited batches or you're anticipating limited manufacturing of batches, that you discuss with the agency any flexibilities on the requirements at the time of marketing, or any flexibilities in how you're launching your commercial manufacturing, your commercial launch plans, essentially. So for example, if you were planning to launch with clinical batches versus the commercial process itself. Thank you.
Thanks. And I believe this question is for you. Are PSB and PPQ batches needed for expedited programs, BLA and NDA?
Thank you. Yes, that does look like it is for me as well. So just to clarify again, the PPQ batches, which is essentially what we call the stage 2 validation of the manufacturing process, is not required for an NDA, for the submission of an NDA. However, it is generally a requirement for BLAs. So BLAs, it is a requirement for the BLA submission that those stage 2 PPQ batches and information be submitted in the marketing application. So that is the difference between BLAs and NDAs. And again, that is also outlined a little more clearly in the map. Thanks for that question.
Thanks for those responses. Let's circle back to Kathy Weil again. So first question, what if I don't receive a letter communicating anticipated PMRs from the agency?
Thank you for that question. If you don't receive a letter, please keep in mind that per the PDUFA VII commitments, that these anticipated letters only apply to NME NDAs and original BLAs, and they don't apply to resubmitted applications. And also remember that the agency, because this is our first year in this new process, we have to meet the goal 60% of the time. So we may not be able to meet it all the time, but we're working very diligently to meet it as much and above 60% of the time for the first year. If you want one and you haven't gotten one, please feel free to reach out to your regulatory project manager, your RPM in the division, and you can always ask about it at that time. Thank you.
Thanks. Another question for you. What if we request release of a PMR in our annual status report or with another submission?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that question came up a little bit earlier about putting it, requesting a meeting versus, asking for it as a specific release request. We may, if it comes in as part of the annual status report, or that it's mentioned, that you're going to request a release, or as part of even another submission other than, say, a meeting request, the agency might reach out to you and request that you submit a release request in a separate submission so that we can accurately track the progress of that request in our system using our notification goals, and make sure that that request is handled appropriately as per our new PDUFA VII commitments.
Thank you. Let's do one more question for you. We have here, if we receive a request for additional information about a release request, what information should we provide?
Yes, thank you again. So the letter that requests the additional information should explain exactly what the agency needs to better understand that request for release. If it does not, and you need further clarification, please reach out to your regulatory project manager for the division before you respond to the letter. If you happen to respond to that letter before having a clear idea of what you want to provide, we have the opportunity to send another additional request for information that will add to that and explain further what we're looking for. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Let's move back to Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, would stimulated C-peptide be a qualifying endpoint in the REdI pilot program for indications in preventing or stopping progression of autoimmune type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, so in terms of our DIA proposal eligibility, what you're going to want to remember is that the first the first gate is the sponsor has an active pre-IND or IND for a rare disease. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Namely, if you don't yet have an active development program but are initiating a natural history study where the proposed endpoint is intended to be studied, which would be applicable to a rare disease, or if you have a common disease that you are studying that includes an innovative or novel endpoint that you can then justify as applicable to a rare disease. That's sort of the first type of eligibility criteria that one has to meet to submit a proposal for REdI. And the second group of eligibility criteria is around the proposed endpoint. So is the endpoint novel? And what we mean by that is if it has never been used before to support a drug approval, or if it's been substantially modified from previous use to support drug approval. So those are the questions to sort of ask. We have a web page up with this and a lot more information, as well as the meeting that we're 2 half-day meetings that we're having coming up to both tomorrow and Thursday. So I hope that people make use of those, and it'll be a lot of good information to share.
Thank you. Let's take one more question for you. What is the current status of the Leader 3D program? Have Leader 3D training events initiated or are training currently available?
Yep, that's a great question, and I'm happy to share on this as well. So Leader 3D, we are currently in the assessment phase. So we've received a lot of feedback from external stakeholders, and now we are reviewing that feedback and determining what are the priorities that our stakeholders really want in order to inform drug development for rare disease products. We're also looking at, what do we currently have available based on their priorities that we could enhance versus what do we need to develop. And so that's the phase that we are in, and what I would really encourage people to do so that you are informed when we start to come out with materials related to Leader 3D is that you can sign up for the CDER ARC newsletter, which was in my slides, and I believe my slides are going to be available shortly if they are not already. But I would really encourage people to sign up for that newsletter because we will always put information related to education and engagement for rare disease stakeholders in there. And there's also the CDER ARC webpage at which there is information on the Leader 3D program.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Let's move on to Dr. Patel again. Dr. Patel, could you comment on the applicability and use of predictive stability models for monoclonal antibodies or fusion protein products to set shelf life and the agency's view on them?
Thanks for this question. This is a really good question. So currently, FDA doesn't generally recommend predictive stability modeling for biologics, including monoclonal antibodies or fusion proteins at this time. The idea is really that the degradation of these types of biologics is unlikely to be amenable to mathematical modeling. With that being said, I think that if there's some sort of sufficient justification or data to support it, that the FDA would certainly want to see that data as part of the justification if an applicant is interested in using or is interested in applying these sorts of models. Thanks.
Thanks. Next question for you. How many years is it anticipated that the pilot program will run?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this is really outlined in the PDUFA VII commitment letter. So the pilot program at this stage is anticipated to run for 4 years from 2023 to 2027, and an FRN is planned to be published annually in case there are any minor changes that need to be made to the pilot as we learn as there are lessons learned annually from the pilot itself. And to kind of get to someone else's question, the idea is that CBER will take about 6 applications a year, and CDER will take about 3. There is some flexibility in that as well. Again, it'll probably just kind of depend on what we see from year to year as we run this pilot. This pilot just initiated in April of this year, so we'll kind of take those lessons learned and apply them to next year. Thank you.
Thanks. And one more for you. Is it still possible to submit the CDER CDRP after 3 projects are accepted? And how do the sponsors know if there's
Yeah, so good question. Yes, so we will be reviewing the applications on about a quarterly basis. So even if 3 applications have been accepted into the pilot, that doesn't mean that a 4th may not be, right? So it really just, it's a case-by-case sort of basis at this stage. But applicants will be notified in about 180 days once whether or not they've been selected into the pilot. And if for some reason an application was not selected, that doesn't mean that that same applicant couldn't come back again for another cycle. So just to kind of, there's a lot of flexibility here, and I think we wanted to convey that since the application process is currently open, but the applications will be reviewed in a rolling manner. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Let's move on to, we have a question that came in for Ms. Kathy Weil. Can we submit more than one request for reconsideration if our release request is denied after requesting reconsideration?
Yes, great question. We consider the request for reconsideration decision sort of the end of that whole released request process. So at this point, that kind of ends the back and forth period about that PMR, and it could be a PMC, but most of the time it's usually going to be a PMR. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have some more questions for Dr. Carrie Jo Lee. Dr. Lee, let's see, here's a question. Difference between the RDEA pilot program and the drug development tool, or DDT, qualification programs.
Right. So the RDEA pilot is really a series of focused meetings specifically on developing a novel endpoint for a rare disease. So if you would like some very focused, promised up to 4 interactions with the FDA, the relevant review division, and additional experts across, CDER or CBER, depending on where the product is. That's sort of the meeting pathway that we would really encourage you to apply to. The drug development tool qualification program is different, and the RDEA program, if you complete that, it doesn't result in qualification of an endpoint. The drug development program really should be for sponsors who want to qualify their COA, their biomarker, or their animal model for use under the animal rule.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Another question for you. When would FDA recommend interacting with the FDA through the RDEA pilot program instead of interacting with the FDA review division through the IND?
Sure. Well, the RDEA pilot program is in addition to whatever interactions are currently going on, and the review divisions will be involved in the RDEA interactions. So if you as a sponsor, rare disease drug development, as I said in my presentation, is very challenging. There's a lot of things to work out for a rare disease drug development program. But if you're a sponsor who wants focused, dedicated time spent solely on developing a novel endpoint, which can often be very challenging, that's really when you want to submit to the RDEA program rather than in addition to your usual meeting interactions with the review division.
Thank you. And we have one more question that just came in for you. How many proposals will be accepted into the RDEA program?
Yeah, so it's a pilot program. So pilot programs tend to start smaller, and we will be accepting proposals on a quarterly basis. We are going to accept one proposal for the phase that is going to be opening on July 1st. So submitted between July 1st and September 30th. There will be one proposal, and it's on the fiscal year. So each new year starts in October. And then for the subsequent years, so fiscal years 24 to 27, we will be accepting one proposal per quarter with a maximum of 3 proposals per fiscal year.
Thank you. We have some questions that came in for Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel, if scale up will delay commercial launch, is it possible to commercially distribute clinical supplies with approved FDA commercial label? Does the clinical supply batch need to be prior to
So thank you for this question. I think to kind of summarize, yes, there is a possibility of launching, so your initial commercial batches being manufactured using clinical supplies. And the process validation can happen after an application. I'm thinking NDA right now, after an NDA is actually approved. But in order to launch with clinical batches, again, this would be in a situation where if you would delay commercial launch if you didn't launch with your clinical batches. If the patient need is there, then that is something that the FDA would consider. But in order to do that, there would be a number of things that you would have to provide as part of your justification. In addition, your manufacturing facilities that manufacture the clinical batches will need to be assessed for acceptability as far as the facility statuses goes, and could be open to inspection if needed, to assure that those were manufactured under GMP and appropriate GMP regulations. And so that would be like the major thing that I think we would need to look at when it comes to the clinical supply that's being used for the commercial batches. But once the expectation is that the process validation stage 2 requirements would still be required after that NDA has been approved. I hope I answered that question. Thank you.
Thanks. Another question. Sponsor apply CDRP again if the request was not accepted the first time?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I think that the idea of the pilot is we will be accepting applications on a rolling basis, and as a program changes, it is encouraged that if an applicant feels like they may want to reapply, maybe something's changed in their program, in their development program, that is highly encouraged at this stage. And we will be reviewing those on a quarterly basis, and kind of assessing where the CMC development is and what challenges exist in the development program as well. So absolutely, that is something that the FDA would consider. Thank you.
Thanks. This next question is addressed to both Kathy Weil and to you, Dr. Patel. If a CMC, PMC, PMR is not on the approval letter or FDA website, how does FDA track completion? Are these still considered optional and not a commitment or requirement?
Thank you. I'll go ahead and take at least the first part of that question, but if I might take an opportunity to go back to the release reconsideration question, I just would like to remind the audience that those requests for reconsideration go up through senior leadership for discussion and review. So that I forgot to add to the prior response. As for this question, if it's a CMC related PMR and a PMC, both of those should be in the approval letter. So I just haven't had an experience where we've agreed upon a post-marketing commitment in writing or required a PMR that's not in the approval letter. As a reminder, all PMRs and 506B PMCs will be available on FDA's website with each quarterly update. And for both of these, all CMC, PMCs, and PMRs are tracked in our database of record. So we monitor their progress using that schedule of milestones that's usually that's provided in the approval letter. Where it says, are these considered optional and not a commitment or a requirement? They're usually anything that's in the approval letter is either agreed upon as a post-marketing commitment, agreed upon in writing in the approval letter, or required in the approval letter. If it's not in the approval letter, it's not an we don't consider that necessarily optional. So that may be different in OPQ's office with PMCs, but I'll let Dr. Patel require or provide a response to that part. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. I mean, I think to just add a little bit to what you already said, there are CMC PMRs often, sometimes. Most often, CMC PMCs are communicated to applicants. We usually work with applicants similar to a PMR in order to outline the requirements and milestones for a PMC, and that's how those PMCs are tracked according to those to the the interim reports and the final reports, and kind of when those deadlines are. Those are also should be submitted, should be provided as part of the approval letter, that there is a PMC associated, a CMC PMC associated with an approval.
Thank you both for those responses. Dr. Carrie Jo Lee, we have one question for you here. What exactly is the difference between CDER ARC and REdI?
That's a good one. So CDER ARC, the Accelerating Rare Disease Cures Program, is an umbrella program, as I explained in my presentation, and it's really sort of the umbrella that sees all rare disease that initiatives and drug development that is going on across the center, in order to really provide strategic oversight on what we need to do in order to really engage with our stakeholders internally as well as externally, to strengthen rare disease drug development. And the REdI program is a PDUFA VII mandated pilot program. So it is a rare disease initiative to which CDER is taking part in, and it will certainly be followed very closely by CDER ARC. It is a PDUFA commitment that the rare diseases team is implementing as part of our PDUFA requirements, in terms of being able to provide rare disease support to the center. And CDER ARC would take learnings from REdI and ensure that they are being translated to all parts of rare disease across the center, as well as beyond to external stakeholders that we can.
Thank you. And I think we are out of time for questions. So we are going to go into a short break. I just wanted to thank again the presenters and panelists for responding to the questions and for your excellent presentations, and to the audience for asking such great questions. So let's take a short break, and we will reconvene at 2:50 Eastern Time. Thank you.